Okay, class, so this is going to be the video on the GI tract, the tube from mouth to anus. So I don't think it's going to be 30 minutes or less. So go ahead and stop this if it gets too long for you. You got your worksheets, you can stop and do your worksheets along the way. So let's get started. So we're going to just start with the oral cavity. So obviously the function of the oral cavity is to ingest food, and then you're going to chew that food. You're going to use your muscles of mastication to chew that food, and you're going to mechanically break down that food. In your oral cavity, you're going to have saliva, and we'll talk about your salivary glands next, that are going to moisten that food, and they are actually going to start the chemical breakdown of that food also. The tongue will actually push that food up on against your hard palate and push that food. Once you've chewed it mindfully, it will push it back into this area called the oropharynx, and that food is now called a bolus. And that bolus is going to be traveling down, hopefully towards the esophagus. The uvula, remember this uvula up here, off of the hard palate, it will go up and prevent food or drink from going up in your nasal cavity. And as you swallow, the epiglottis will come down, cover your airway, and the food will be directed down into the laryngopharynx and then back down into the esophagus. So that's basically all review for you guys. So we have 3 pairs of salivary glands that you need to know. And they're kind of telling you where they are. So this should be easy. Sublingual, sub, underneath, lingual, that has to do with the tongue. So here's the sublingual. You can see the little ducts right there. They're secreting the saliva right underneath the tongue. It's where the dentist loves to put all that gauze under your tongue. And then you have the submandibular salivary glands. And they're right there here's the mandible right here. And then you have the parotid. Parotid, that actually means P-A-R-A, para-otic. It means around the ear, around the ear. So this is the biggest salivary gland, and it is next to the ear. So what is the function of saliva? Well, it's going to moisten the food and keep your mouth moist in between meals. And it will actually help dissolve food through chemicals. It's going to help dissolve food chemicals so you can actually taste them in your taste buds. And saliva contains an enzyme called lysozyme. Lyso sounds like it's lysing something. It's actually lysing the bacterial cell wall. So this is one of your first lines of defense against any bacteria that you may be ingesting, taking in through your mouth. So lysozyme digests bacterial cell walls, and it has an enzyme amylase. Amylase will actually begin the chemical digestion, the chemical breakdown of starchy foods into sugars. So let's look at those salivary glands on a classroom model. So here we have the tongue. So underneath the tongue, we have the sublingual. Here's the submandibular. And out next to the ear is our parotid gland. And you can actually see the duct here. This is actually dumping saliva into the cheek area. So those are your salivary glands. So be sure you know what their function is and where you find these 3 guys. So now that you have you have chewed your food mindfully and you have made it into a bolus, we see the tongue pushing up against the hard palate and pushing that bolus of food back into the oropharynx and down into the laryngopharynx. This uvula is closing off the nasal cavity, and the epiglottis will come down and direct that bolus of food down into the esophagus. Now, when you swallow, the actual act of you swallowing up here, this is skeletal muscle. You are controlling that swallowing. Now, once we get into the esophagus, the food is now into the esophagus. The esophagus is a muscular tube that is just carrying that bolus of food down into the stomach. The interesting thing about the esophagus is the upper 1/3 is skeletal muscle. The middle 1/3 is going to be a mixture of skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. And by the time you get to the distal 1/3 of the esophagus, it is all smooth muscle. So once you initiate swallowing with your skeletal muscles, it will be sent down the esophagus through peristalsis, through those peristaltic waves that will take it into the stomach. Now, obviously, the esophagus has to go through the diaphragm because the esophagus is in the thoracic cavity. It's got to get into the abdominal cavity, and it is going to enter the abdominal cavity through a little gap in the diaphragm called the hiatus. Hiatus. So write that word down. For some reason, that's not on your master list, but you need to know what that word is. The hiatus. That is the hole in the diaphragm that the esophagus passes through. So we're going to look at briefly the histology of the esophagus. We've already gone through the 4 layers of the tube that are found throughout the gastrointestinal tract. So here we have the lining epithelium. So we have lining epithelium, which in the esophagus is going to be stratified squamous. So you can't really tell this is stratified squamous. Maybe you can. But this is all stratified squamous. Wear and tear, non-keratinized. Here is the lamina propria. Here is the muscularis mucosa. So this muscularis mucosa, lamina propria, and the stratified squamous, that is all your mucosa, remember? This is your submucosa, this area, and then you have your inner circular and outer longitudinal layers in your muscularis externa, and here is your adventitia. So I already went through that. Oh, there is no digestive and absorptive function in the esophagus. Its main purpose is to take the bolus of food into the stomach. Now, the reason I want you to know about the hiatus, here's your model in the classroom. This is the opening. Here's this esophagus coming through the diaphragm. Here's your diaphragm. So this opening, the hiatus. So this hiatus, there's something called hiatal hernias. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of a hiatal hernia. That is when part of the stomach is actually going up into this hole. There's a weakening in this hole, in this hiatus, and it's letting some of the stomach come up into the thoracic cavity. So hiatal hernias can become a major problem if they can get huge. So I just wanted to show you that. So here is your classroom model showing you the esophagus coming through the hiatus, and now it's joining the stomach. So at this junction where the the esophagus is joining the stomach. This is called the cardia. So that's on your master list, the cardia. That is the junction between the esophagus and the stomach. And here we see the stomach, how it sits in the abdominal cavity. This is the entire stomach here. And this is mostly going to be, here's the liver. The liver was taken out. So the liver's in the right upper quadrant. This is on the other side, more in the left quadrant, and the epigastric area here. So let's look at the stomach more closely. So here's our classroom stomach model. I took it out of our torso model. It needs some deep cleaning, I can tell. But here again, here is the cardia, the junction between the esophagus and the stomach. This top part right here, is called the fundus. So this is on your worksheet, so you can get your worksheet and stop this video once we get done with this and fill it out. This is the fundus. This is the body of the stomach, this main part. The pyloric region is going to be starting around here. Pyloric region. Here's the innards, the inside of the stomach. Here again, this is showing you the junction of the esophagus and the stomach. This is the cardia. This part up here is the fundus. This is the body. And this is the pyloric region. There's going to be a valve down here. We can't quite see it here. It's called the pyloric valve. I have a better picture to show you for that. And then you see all these foldings in the stomach. Oops, all these foldings. These are called rugae. Rugae allow the stomach to stretch after you've had a large meal. So they're going to just allow the stomach to stretch to hold more food if you've eaten a large meal. So I think that's all. Oh, here's the lesser curvature. And here is the greater curvature. Makes sense, right? I wanted to show you on this picture, here is the junction where the esophagus and the stomach come together, the cardia, and right next to that, right above it, is going to be what they call the gastroesophageal sphincter. So this is smooth muscle. This is a smooth muscle. The inner circular smooth muscle is enlarged in this area, and it is helping prevent the reflux of the stomach contents from going back up into the esophagus. And when you do get stomach contents going back up into the esophagus, that is called reflux. You're refluxing, and the stomach is very acidic, so you can get, we call it GERD, G-E-R-D, gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD. So I want to show you that sphincter. It's not very strong. Nothing new here. We can kind of see the pyloric sphincter better here. So the pyloric sphincter is going to be important because when you eat a big meal and it's being broken down by the stomach, the food in your stomach is going to be slowly let out through this pyloric sphincter. Just a little bit at a time is going to be coming out. So this is your worksheet. So after I go through all this, fill out your worksheet. Again, here's the esophagus. The cardia is at this junction of the esophagus with the stomach. This part up here is the fundus. This part of the stomach is the body. Here is the pyloric region. This is the lesser curvature. This is the greater curvature. This is the rugae. Here is the pyloric sphincter. You can see the pyloric sphincter right there. That's just smooth muscle also. And this first part of the small intestines right here, this is the duodenum. Some people call it the duodenum. Duodenum, duodenum. And we were talking about the muscularis externa. Everywhere else in the GI tract, we have two layers, an inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer. We have a third layer in our muscularis externa. We have an inner oblique layer. Now, the outer layer is always going to be the longitudinal layer. No matter where you are in the GI tract, the outer layer is always the longitudinal layer. Deep to the longitudinal layer is always going to be the circular layer. And all you have to do is look at the muscle fibers here, and they tell you what they are. These muscle fibers are going in a longitudinal direction. This is going in a circular direction, wrapping around the stomach, and these fibers are an oblique arrangement. So why do we need this extra inner oblique smooth muscle layer? Well, this isn't showing it. I just wanted to show you this. This is actually menudo. This is the stomach. Here is your rugae right here. So just so you know what you are eating when you're eating menudo. It's just the inner, this is the stomach. So I wanted to go through the epithelium of the stomach. So we said everything from the mouth, the laryngopharynx, esophagus was stratified squamous, non-keratinized. Once we hit the stomach, everything else from here on down till we get to the anal canal is simple columnar. So here is our stomach, and they're taking a little section of it. So you're going to see the layers of the stomach. Well, part of them here. You're going to see part of them here. This is showing you the mucosa. Here is the muscularis mucosa, that line right there. So this whole thing is mucosa. Remember, mucosa is the lining epithelium, the lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. Below that is the submucosa. If you do not remember that, you need to review the first video I made. You have to know that. So here we are taking this. We are looking at the lining epithelium. Here's our simple columnar. And we're going to have what we call gastric pits. There's these little, this is the surface of the stomach, and we're going to have these pits going down. And in these pits, we're going to have these gastric cells that are lining these pits. So here we have our simple columnar. We're going to go into a gastric pit, and then we have 4 different cells that are in this pit that are going to be secreting stuff into this pit. The first one is the mucus cells. These mucus cells are up at the top. These are all mucus cells. They are up at the top by the surface of this stomach here. They are secreting alkaline mucus. What is alkaline? It has a pH greater than 7. Why would we want to make mucus that is alkaline? Because you will find out very shortly, the pH of the stomach is around 2 to 3. So we are going to be coating the lining of our stomach here with a thick coat of alkaline mucus. We don't want to be burning holes in our stomach. The next cell down are going to be called parietal cells. Now these parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid, HCl, hydrochloric acid. That will give your stomach a pH of 2 to 3. Now, a lot of people think the pH is so low to help digest our food. No, the main purpose of a low pH like that is to kill any bacteria that may have gotten into the stomach. So that low pH will hopefully kill out the majority of bacteria. And the parietal cells also secrete something called intrinsic factor. Now, this intrinsic factor is necessary to absorb vitamin B12 in our intestines. If you don't have intrinsic factor, you can't absorb vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is necessary for the formation of our red blood cells. So you have to know the parietal cells too. If you want, make little index cards with these guys. The next cell down are the chief cells. So these chief cells down here, they secrete something called pepsinogen. Now, pepsinogen by itself is inactive. It doesn't do anything. But in the acid conditions of the stomach, if you add HCl to pepsinogen, you will make an active digestive enzyme called pepsin. And pepsin will break down proteins into amino acids. So remember, chief cells secrete pepsinogen. That is inactive. Doesn't do anything until it's activated by the addition of hydrochloric acid, which will convert it to pepsin. Pepsin is an active enzyme that will break down protein, pepsin for protein, into amino acids. And the bottommost cells down here, these are actually secreting a hormone. These G cells secrete the hormone gastrin. Hormones are released into the blood. This hormone is going to be released in the blood after you've eaten a meal, and it will trigger the release of more pepsinogen and more hydrochloric acid from these parietal and chief cells. And it's also going to start the movement of all these smooth muscles, starting them to contract more. Oh, I put this down so I wouldn't forget. This is not a place of absorption. We don't absorb much from our stomach. Absorption is taking place in the small intestines. Except you can absorb alcohol straight away from the stomach. So that's probably why they always say eat before you start drinking, slow down the absorption of alcohol. Alcohol is absorbed straight out of the stomach. You don't have to wait till it goes into the small intestines. And aspirin. Aspirin is absorbed straight away from the stomach. Aspirin, I think we talked about it one time, is an antiplatelet. It will inhibit platelets from coming together so you don't get a clot. So aspirin is something you give people right away. If you suspect that they're having a heart attack, you will give them aspirin right away to hopefully get absorbed straight away from the stomach and prevent any further clotting. So here is another picture. If you look over on this side here, here is the floor of the stomach. And we said we had these gastric pits, lots of gastric pits, and then we have our mucus cells here. We have our parietal, chief, and G cells in here, and they are secreting their stuff. So that's what they look like here. So here is the lining epithelium, simple columnar. Here's the lamina propria. Here's the muscularis mucosa, the submucosa, inner oblique, smooth muscle. Here is the middle circular smooth muscle, and here is the outer longitudinal smooth muscle, and this is the serosa. Remember, the stomach is surrounded by serosa. Here it is on a histo slide. It looks almost exactly like it. So we can see our lining epithelium is simple columnar. We have our lamina propria here. This is all lamina propria. And this is just showing you cross sections of all these gastric glands. These are gastric glands down here. They call them gastric glands because glands are secreting something into a tube onto a surface. So this is just cross sections of all these gastric glands. Here is the muscularis mucosa right here. So this is all mucosa. This is your submucosa down here. So hopefully you can kind of make sense of this. This one's real easy to see. So this is like great lab practical material right there. So what happens when things go wrong? If you get a gastric ulcer, I mean, depending on how bad they are, you can get gastric ulcers that will start burning through the layers, your 4 layers. This one is just burned through the mucosa and the submucosa. It hasn't burned through the muscle layer. This one has burned through all the layers. It is now a hole. So it is burned all the way through. So now what is happening? Well, you're probably going to die if this happens. The hydrochloric acid, all those secretions from the stomach are going to be released into your abdominal cavity. That's probably going to die. You're going to get duodenal ulcers too, because the duodenum, this first part of the small intestine, is receiving all that acid. Remember, the pH here is 2 to 3, so that acid is being dumped into the duodenum. So just wanted to show you that. Now, this is why you have that third layer of smooth muscle, that inner oblique, because we are going to be doing something in the stomach that's not just peristalsis. We are going to be churning. What the stomach does, it has these rhythmic waves called churning. It moves the bolus up and down, up and down. And when it's doing that, it's kind of like a washing machine, up and down, churning that food, mixing it with all those gastric secretions. And this food, this bolus, is slowly, just a little bit at a time, is going to be let out through this pyloric valve into the duodenum. So that is why we have that third inner oblique layer, so we can churn. Now we're going to churn this bolus and we're going to make it into chyme. So once the stomach has churned it, we're going to turn that bolus into chyme. So you have to know that too. Chyme. Churn to chyme. Well, I see it's already been 30 minutes, and I think what I'll do is go ahead and stop it here and then have a second video starting from the small intestines.